Gathered friends, welcome to Bionicle Fandom Reviews, the show where I build, review, and showcase every single one of the fan-created, canonized Bionicle models over the entirety of Bionicle Generation 1's 10-year run. In 2005, the LEGO Group officially hosted Dark Hunter and Rahi canon contests, showcasing fan mocks in official media like books. Even moving onwards all the way up to 2010, fan websites like BZ Power continued to host canon contests, enriching the world of Bionicle with new depictions, artwork, and builds. And even now, there's been a renaissance of canon contests. Thanks to TTV and sponsored by Greg Farshdi, the original scribe of Bionicle, we have modern canonization contests depicting characters that we never thought would see the light of day and are still ongoing right now. Now, throughout the show, it is my own goal to own, build, review, and showcase every single fan-created canonized model created for Bionicle, and share these reviews with all of you. And while we mostly stick to canon models, there are a few rare exceptions which shine through. Fan mocks depicting their versions of Bionicle characters, canon or otherwise, that are so exemplary that they deserve a review of their own. For every Bionicle fandom review, I rank the builds by 4 key points. Number 1 is posability. Can the model get in good poses? Can it support its own weight? And can it hold the weight of its own weapons, or is it just falling over? Number 2 is building techniques. Is the model just regurgitating stuff from existing LEGO sets, or is it trying something new and doing that well as using unique parts usages? Number 3 is overall aesthetics. How good does the model look completely agnostic of storyline relevance, and is it generally aesthetically appealing? And finally, number 4 is believability in universe, which means that does the storyline given to the model by the Bionicle story team make sense given how the model is built, and does the model scale well next to some representative samples from the Bionicle universe? And with that, let's consider these 4 points and more as we jump into a brief story and lore explanation of today's featured build. Alright, so for today's Bionicle Fanon review, we have the much anticipated Toa Hagah Gaaki. She was one of the original members of the Toa team assigned to guard the Brotherhood of Makuta, specifically to guard Makuta Pterodax as the Makuta of Metru Nui. The Toa Hagah eventually realized the Brotherhood of Makuta was slowly being corrupted and turned against him, stealing the Evoki, or the Mask of Light, from the grasp of the Brotherhood, but unfortunately being mutated into the Rahaga in the process by Rudaka's Rotuka Spinner. Toa Gaki in particular wore the Mask of Clairvoyance, which allows her to get random flashes of the future in terms of visions. She really has no control over this. She doesn't have any control in terms of when she will get these visions. They just kind of come, and as Norik mentioned at one point, the mask kind of tends to use her instead of her using the mask, but she still kept it around because sometimes it's just useful to get random flash forwards to the future. In general, she also commanded the element of water as usual with a tidal spear, much like the other Toa Hagah who all wielded spears, as well as a Rotuka shield. And with that, we can now move on to the actual review of Toa Gaki. Super excited to jump into these. It's been a long time coming. I've had the Toa Hagah sitting in a box waiting for spray paint and waiting for the final masks for the longest time. And finally, we're ready to go. So let's jump right in. Alright, so here we have the official canonized model for Toa Hagah Gaaki. And before we get started, a lot of people will be curious as to how exactly I achieved the custom copper look. I do want to preface this by saying this was personally my first time spray painting official LEGO pieces. I'm not a big fan of modifying the colors of official LEGO pieces, but I will do it if the model is cool enough or officially canonized, like this. So for this I didn't really have a choice, and maybe you'll see me reviewing some other spray painted Bionicle models in the future, but this one I basically kind of just had to. So what I did was that I took the official LEGO models, or the LEGO pieces here, for this piece here, which was the Borak Call shield. I also got the Metru torso armor here, the 2007 armor pieces, the Haga shield, Metru armor, Metru feet, the Prydak blade here, as well as a custom 3D printed mask, which was based off of the winning artwork, and I sprayed them with white primer. This was really important because I actually tried to spray paint particularly this piece without white primer, and the spray paint just kind of fell off. Because this one, especially being somewhat rubberized, really needed the white primer in order for the color to actually work.
Once I had the white primer laid down, I then spray painted each of the pieces with this copper spray paint. And essentially what I had to do to figure out what color to use is that I took one of the official LEGO copper pieces, went over to Home Depot, and just put it against the lids until I found the right color of spray paint to closely match the official LEGO copper color. It's not quite perfect, and looking at it now, there are a few spots here and there where I just didn't do that good of a job spray painting. I may go over this with a few more layers after the review is done, but just keep that in mind when you're taking a look at it. It's not perfect, but it's probably the best I could personally do given that I had never done any of this before. And I'm actually fairly happy with how it turned out. It's a really striking and cool color scheme, which we'll take a look at when we get into point 3 aesthetics. Now, I do want to note that this particular mask has been modeled by the 3D modelist Galva. I've included a link in the description below, specifically modeled as a close match to the canon artwork. I do know that a lot of other 3D modelers have tried their hands at making the masks. King K, who actually has appeared on this channel quite a few times before, had his own version as well, which I think is also a really cool option. I personally just printed this because it just was one of the first readily available ones that I had available to print, but I do think he did quite a good job of the model as well. Galva also has released a second version of the mask, which has slightly been changed around somewhat to more fit the official Bionicle style. However, this is the canon version, which is essentially the one meant to closely match the artwork the best, so I decided to use this one for the official review. Personally, I'm a big fan of the way the mask turned out. I'm a really big fan of how it looks like in the artwork, and I think it's also a big improvement over the previous one, which was actually the official winning model, because of course only the artwork is canonized, not the model itself. But so, without further ado, I think we can just jump right in and get into the review. As I mentioned, there are 4 key points for the review: posability, building techniques, aesthetics, and believability in universe, and so we're going to start off with number 1, posability. And this will be fairly easy, because a lot of this is just a standard Metru build. So obviously starting off with the legs, there is nothing crazy going on here. You get pretty much the standard amount of articulation you would expect out of a Toa Metru build, which is quite good actually. You can get a lot of good poses out of the legs here, really bend the legs all the way back and forth. It's using the Paraka limb pieces, which really does give an extra layer of height to Gaaki, which I think is a really cool thing, kind of sets her apart from some of the other Hagah, as well as, of course, you just have the standard articulation with the ball joints for the feet and the limbs here. Moving on upwards, there's something a little bit more interesting going on with the upper arms, and to be honest, I think this is where it could have been improved the most. You see, back here, there is a ball joint to add friction to the arm movements, which is really great because it means that you can actually get this into action poses, much like the official Toa Hagah, except it actually has friction, so it will hold the poses. Unfortunately, I do think this was a bit of a misstep here, because there is no way to turn the axle. There is no gear on the back where I can twist it and actually have the arm move as an action feature. It really just kind of terminates here, and they easily could have solved this by just using a longer axle and putting a gear on the back. Now, I do understand that maybe this would have felt like it was sticking out a little bit too much. I'm assuming the builder did not include a gear in the back, specifically because it maybe felt like there was just too much bulk in the back here, and they wanted to keep it a much more slimmer design, which I do understand, but I do really wish that there was a way to actually move the arm as an actual play function without actually just having to, well, move the arm like this, because as it is, it's not really that much of a play function and more of just a rigid pose function, and having this be able to be posed up and down doesn't really set it apart any differently from this arm, which you also just have to move to pose up and down, which is mounted on a standard Technic pin, and really all in all that essentially means that this is kind of useless because you're getting the same amount of play on either arm, except this one actually had to have the ball joint here. It's not like this is heavier than this arm is actually lighter than this arm, so not really sure why they actually wanted to go through. Kind of feels like a halfway measure to include friction here for the action feature, but not have actually any way to actuate the action feature itself. So personally, that's kind of a miss to me, but again, it's LEGO. This is super easy to fix. If I want to, I will just either pull this out a little bit more, or I'll just use a longer axle and I'll stick a gear on the back, and problem solved. It'll be very easy. In fact, let's do that right now. So I've got a literal random gear here. Let's just kind of stick that on the back. There you go. Action feature. Problem solved. You can swing the arm back and forth, much like an action feature. So that's all you need to do to fix it. You just get any random piece, maybe pull this out a little bit, and you can just use it to move it around. So not a huge deal to me, just something I did want to point out as one thing I do feel like could have been improved with the building techniques for the posability itself. But otherwise, I think I'm pretty happy with it. Now this is using the standard Toa Metru style build, which means that unfortunately you cannot pose the arms past this particular angle. You can't actually bend the arms outwards, you can't go like this because they're not mounted on ball joints, which I do think while it is accurate to the original models of the Toa Hagah, I probably personally would have preferred a little bit more articulation. For instance, if you look at the Toa Bomanga build, they managed to work in a friction gear function as well as actually mounting these on ball joints, which personally I think would have been the most optimal way of doing so. You would have been able to pose the arms up and down and back and forth, but also still have the friction gear function. This kind of has a friction gear function that you can't actually actuate, and unfortunately you can't actually move the arms outwards. So while it is accurate to the official LEGO models, it does restrict posability quite a bit. And obviously the head itself, you can just move that back and forth fairly well, nothing too much to say about the head, you get a full range of articulation there. With that though, we can now move on to point number 2, which is building techniques. And again, I kind of covered a little bit of this when I was talking about the gear function here, or the lack thereof, but all in all, I think I am fairly happy with the building techniques being used in this model. It is not the most interesting of the Toa Hagah, obviously it's just kind of a standard Metru build with a few additions here and there. I do like the usage of the tubes here, really kind of does make it feel, again, more like a Toa of water, having the breathing tubes in the back here, and I actually really like the way that the 2007 armor pieces are mounted here. I'm a big fan of the way they look on the sides of the arms. I would not have expected them to use this piece, but it is a very aquatic piece. After all, it was designed for 2007 and Mari Nui and the Baraki, so I'm pretty happy with the way this looks on the arm here, and I think that in terms of building techniques and parts usages, it did a really good job. And actually, on that topic, it's probably a good time to talk about the other parts usages here that really make me appreciate this as a Toa of water. First of all, they use the Galak Borak shield here, which obviously is meant to be a flipper, really adding on to the aquatic nature of this model, and the Prydak blade here is again supposed to be some sort of an aquatic blade. And obviously, the LEGO designers did the job for them, but this very clearly feels like some sort of a shark fin, or something aquatic. And all in all of that combined leads to a very aquatic appearance for Gaaki as a Toa of water. Especially with the Toa Hagah, where the metallic armor pieces can sometimes detract a little bit from the core elements of the Toa, I think it's a really nice touch that all of the metallic elements, or at least the ones that could be customized, are specifically meant to be related to something aquatic. You've got the Baraki armor pieces here, the Galak piece here, and the Prydak piece here. Everything that was designed to be something related to an underwater Bionicle build. And that is a parts usage that I can really appreciate. And then with that, we can move on to point number 3, which is the general aesthetics of this model. Now, I do want to say that I think the copper coloration goes a long way in making this model really stand out. And honestly, this is probably one of my favorite Toa Hagah yet in terms of the color scheme. There's something about the combination of copper and dark blue that really works out for this model. And of course, the mask choice as well really just ties the model together. It very much feels like a knight or a paladin type of feel, very regal and very ancient, and the copper armor really does make this feel like an elite guard of the Makuta, which is obviously what the Toa Hagah were supposed to be. So that is something I really appreciate about this model. I just love the way this looks aesthetically, and it's probably, again, one of my favorite Toa Hagah aesthetically speaking. You get the underwater or water themed influence with the pieces here. The color scheme is a killer color scheme. I love the way this looks, and this is why I voted for every entry that had the metallic armor or the copper colored armor for Gaaki, because I'm a big fan of the way this one turned out. All in all, aesthetically speaking, this is a really great model. You can really see that it's supposed to be a tall and slim warrior while still actually having this very interesting metallic armored look. With that though, we can now move on to point number 4, which is believability in universe. And to do so, I've brought alongside some representative samples from the official Bionicle sets. First of all, we have the Hagah Gaaki. This is supposed to be the same character, but just in the Hagah form. So I felt like it was important to just include both of those for the size comparison here. We also have one of the official Toa Hagah sets. This is Toa Hagah Norik here, as well as Toa Hagah Iruni on this side. So you can immediately see here that Toa Gaki is around the same height as Iruni, especially when he's standing up fully tall. She's actually a little bit taller because I've bent the leg a little bit here, and Norik is a little bit more short and squat. Obviously he's in a squatting pose here, but even if I stand Norik up all the way, he is still not quite as tall as Gaki, which threw me off a little bit at first when I was actually lining them up for the group photo. You can see here he is very clearly shorter than Gaki, but honestly it doesn't really bother me too much. Wow, his foot just fell off. That's weird. Anyway, doesn't bother me too much because I honestly think that she actually is a lot more distinct by being a little bit taller than the rest of the Toa Hagah. At full height, Gaki will be taller than Iruni, which let's just adjust the legs here to really just have the character be at full height here, and that is something that I think does actually add quite a bit of character to, well, this character. It really makes her feel like she has a very distinctive silhouette when compared to the rest of the Toa Hagah, while still very clearly fitting in with the rest of the team. And so, for believability in universe, point number 4, I'm just going to go ahead and give her a 10 out of 10. The metallic armor fits in really well, especially the slightly more muted shade of copper. It's a darker copper which fits in well with the flat dark gold, as well as the silver of Norik here. Just some really good color scheme choices here in general, and obviously, despite her being taller than the rest of the teammates, it feels like she has her own unique identity while still actually fitting in with the rest of the team. So believability in universe absolutely makes sense to me, and really drives home the point by actually using these aquatic Bionicle elements, which have only previously appeared on other water-themed Bionicle characters. Setting the other models aside for now, let's now take a look at just Toa Hagah Gaaki by herself so we can rank her on the rest of the points for this review. And so, starting off with Posability, this one, to be honest, is a bit of a mixed bag for me personally. Obviously, no complaints about the legs, those are just the standard legs. The complaints come in the forms of the upper arms here, which I talked about earlier in the review. I just think there was an easier way to actually incorporate this type of action feature, or if you're gonna have the action feature, at least have the gear in the back so you can turn it. If you're not gonna have the action feature, then this did not need to be there, which adds bulk to the back, because both arms could have easily been mounted like this arm was right here using just the Technic pins. It's difficult trying to have it both ways, but not really committing to either one. You don't have that good of an action feature because you have to actually bend the arm to actually make the action feature work, which kind of defeats the purpose because it's meant to swing on its own. You also don't have the optimal amount of posability because the arms are just mounted in on the axles here. Do note that for Norik and Iruni, I've actually modified the official sets to mount on ball joints here. We'll talk about that a little bit more when I actually get to the final review, but as it is right now, unfortunately the articulation is limited because you can't move them outwards like so. And so for the posability of this model, I am going to give it a score of 6 out of 10. I am not a big fan of the attempt to include an action feature, but not actually make it a true action feature. The articulation is limited by the amount of articulation here just being restricted to the standard Metro build, and there's a lot of strange stuff going on, like the inclusion of the ball joint for friction here for seemingly no reason because you can't actually use it for the action feature. That being said, as we move on to building techniques, some of that does still apply. I do not really understand why they incorporated half of an action feature, but everything else is really great, and honestly kind of offsets my complaints, specifically with the parts usages. With a contest like this, where you really couldn't do anything too different from the norm, especially for just a standard Toa like this, I really cannot stress how much I appreciate the parts usage here. These are basically the 3 pieces that you could use to differentiate this from other builds, and I think these 3 are pretty much perfect, and I totally can understand why this was the official canonized model. First of all, again, you've got the aquatic callbacks to previous water-themed Bionicle sets, here, and here. That all does a really great job of convincing me that this is a Toa of water, even when the color scheme might not suggest it or might distract a little bit from the official element. The parts usages here are absolutely fantastic, and that really offsets a lot of the complaints I have about the arms and whatnot because those are very easy to mod. These are not easy to mod and required actually a good amount of thinking in terms of what looks good on a Toa of water, and I applaud the builder for incorporating those into this particular build. And so I'm going to give it a 9 out of 10 in terms of building techniques. Really wish that the arms were improved in terms of either committing fully to an action feature or not having an action feature and committing fully to posability, but all in all, I love the parts usages so much that it really offsets some of my negative feelings on the torso. And with that, we can move on to general aesthetics, and yeah, point number 3 is going to get a 10 out of 10. I mentioned before, I love the color scheme. Copper and dark blue look so good together. The winning artwork made it look really good, and it looks just as good in person. The mask especially really complementing the look and feel and tying the whole look together. I really don't have too much else to say about it. I like the inclusion of the tubes, really actually adds a bit of a character to it, and also makes the silhouette very distinct. I like the parts usages, also really adds on to the water feel, and all in all, I think that this overall is one of the best looking canonized Toa Hagah, and honestly kinda looks better than some of the official sets. And so, with that, we have summed up my review on Toa Hagah Gaaki. In case you missed it last time, Bionicle Fanon Reviews is moving to a bi-weekly release. Instead of having weekly Bionicle Fanon Reviews, they will be coming out every other week instead. So tune in 2 weeks, where we're going to do the massive roundup. We're going to look at all of the Toa Hagah together as one cohesive team, talk about my personal improvements and upgrades that I would suggest for each of the builds, and rank each of the Toa Hagah in terms of how they are as official sets, as canonized models, and as members of the team. So stay tuned for that. Thank you all so much for tuning into Duckbricks, and subscribe for even more LEGO news, reviews, discussion, and analyses coming your way very, very soon. Thanks so much, and bye-bye for now.